Hello, CharterFolk. Very excited about this morning. Very excited that we're having our fourth CharterFolk chat. Very excited that we're having our first chat that will be a panel. Very excited about the three distinguished people who will be participating on the panel. And finally, very excited about the topic, the result of these elections and their impact on Charter World. Our folks that are joining us today really need very little introduction. They've been working in charter schools for so long. They're so respected for their commitment and for their smarts that I don't need to go on very long. But I will mention we've got with us Andy Rotherham, who is the founder and partner at Bellwether. We have Derrell Bradford, who is the executive president at 50 Can. And we have Hanna Skandera, who is the founder and the CEO of Mile High Strategies. And among many other things that she has done in her career, she served as the Secretary of Education in the state of New Mexico. Very excited to have all of you. Thank you so much for being here. I'll tell you that there's an excitement and a buzz about this because I've had people texting me and emailing me this morning saying, I wish this was a live stream. I'd love to be on this thing. So just speaks to how excited people are to hear your opinions and how actually the moment requires, being able to process these results with people who we trust. And for you guys to be here is just something I really feel very, very fortunate to have. I think I'll start with turning to Derrell. Derrell, would you mind just sharing with us some thoughts about just the presidential election, what the significance is of having a president-elect now like Joe Biden, someone who has spent the majority of his career as a person known to be supportive of charter schools, but who during the campaign certainly surfaced a number of comments that were of grave support, a grave concern to many charter folk, myself included. What's your first take on this election of Joe Biden?
Yeah, so Jed, first of all, thanks for having me, and happy to be here with my distinguished colleagues. Second, I really like your Frank Lloyd Wright lamp and the Escher painting in the corner. That's good stuff. So, overall, I would say, and I wrote something about this a couple of years ago. The Democratic Party has seemed like it is struggling with its public-private partnership roots. And it's like government can answer everything kind of like current affliction. And the public-private partnership roots gave us like charter policy, right? It's what's the best we can get out of like markets, choice, and philanthropy and the private sector with sort of government oversight, whatever. And I'm a supporter of that. I think that's given us some really good things. And it's certainly given, if you look at, DFR's poll from 3.5 years ago, it's given lots of African-American and Hispanic people schools that they like and enjoy. I guess polling is like 60% charter approval among African-American women in particular, and it also very high among Hispanic women. So I just want to kind of like throw that out there. And I throw that out there only to say that, like you, I found the whole kind of like deterioration of the discussion around charter policy during the primaries like incredibly unsettling. And I guess the number one reason, which is the most important reason I found it unsettling, and why at the NEA's sort of like town hall where President-elect Biden appeared very strident about charter schools, why I found it most troubling was because Black folks delivered Biden the primary, like in every way possible. So I'm always like, why you want to pick on the schools that Black people like? Like what's these folks have been your allies. Clyburn was your ally. We got you. My people got you over the finish line here. So I'm sort of highlighting all of that to say that the most important thing I think about what the president-elect will or won't do, to me, is less about what he said during the campaign, because he is kind of like an old school campaigner who I think is not one of these people who campaigns like crazy and then tries to govern the same way, like Bill de Blasio, for instance. But look, his best surrogate was Barack Obama, right? He's like the number one person out front for him down the stretch. Everybody and everybody's mama was interviewing Obama about how great, Biden was. And, when Obama was president, the NEA did not back him. They did not support his campaign. When he appeared at their campaign virtually, they booed him, right? So like, to me, you're the president. This is your boy, right? He helped put you over the top. What are you going to do with his legacy? And I think that's a very important question we need to be. He needs to answer, like with his actions, who he picks, like how he changes his rhetoric, how he doesn't change his rhetoric between now, January 20th, and then obviously on into the future.
Great starting point. I like that Obama surrogate comment a lot. Very smart. Thank you for that. Hanna, what are your reactions at the top of the ticket?
Yeah. So first, completely agree with what Derrell said, and to me, the fact that we didn't see, at least from all appearances at this moment, a blue wave, and that we look to have a potential, balance in the balancing factor in the Senate, I think could contribute to Derrell's query and how Biden walks that out and feels the pressure of finding, this is me being optimistic, a more moderating candidate as far as the Secretary of Ed. If I give you my core quick reaction, I'm not optimistic. I am deeply concerned about the Secretary of Ed role, even though it's not as powerful as most cabinet seats, et cetera, et cetera. I've worked at the U.S. Department of Ed. You can get a lot done if you want to. And we can talk about that later, but I would just say my optimistic, hopeful self is that there's a moderating piece to not just on top of what Derrell said around the new president moderating himself, but also that there will be factors that help him moderate and provide a check and balance, for lack of a better way of saying it. So I'm hopeful there. I am actually, in my core, less optimistic that takes place, and worried about the tenor and the direction that his education focus will move him, because I think he is beholden and made some commitments that if he's going to keep his word to the people who helped get him elected. I mean, this is the thing. I'm basically saying, well, I hope the president-elect doesn't keep his word to his constituents that he serves, which is another problem. On the education front, I'm not going to lie. I don't see his campaign promises being a win for our country when it comes to choice and charters for kids.
Certainly my experience. I hear you, Derrell. We don't govern exactly the same way that we run, but what people say during campaigns often ends up being really darn important. And there certainly were some things said here that were very sobering. Andy, want to throw in some thoughts just about top of the ticket?
Yeah, I mean, I think, a lot's been said here. A couple of things to think about. We're going to talk later about sort of the parties and their evolution. And, obviously, like the Republican Party, they need to figure out their cross pressure between sort of Trumpism and their opportunity potentially to build a pretty genuine multiracial working class party. Which way they go, we can talk about that. Right now, in terms of this issue with the secretary and policy and so forth, is what's front and center. The Democrats are cross-pressured. They have sort of a professional class that does not like charter schools, sort of very elite progressive class. They do not like charter schools. As Derrell said, they have a party base where you wouldn't know it from the rhetoric, but charters are actually quite popular, as are other choice options and so forth. And Democrats are going to have to, that's always been a tension. The Democrats are going to have to navigate that pretty carefully. And I agree with the point that like the secretary matters. It's also all that sub-cabinet stuff matters. And so the threats to charters tend to be, that tends to be more where they would live to the extent they manifest themselves. Biden is giving every signal, though, that he wants to be a unifier and he's not looking to have, there's obviously lots of pressure on him to sort of pick these various holy wars, but he's sending every signal that he appreciates his task is to stitch the country back up. We have really become a powder keg, not over charter schools or anything to do with charter schools, but just more generally. And I think he's going to be looking for places to build consensus and so forth. The one thing I think that the election has shown that we should talk about, this top of the ticket issue, is, African-American voters are rightly getting a lot of attention in the election in sort of different ways with regard to political behavior. you have like institutional interests, though, like the Congressional Black Caucus, the teachers unions, and so forth. And I do think one thing this election is surfacing is just charters have not done the work to build those kinds of relationships. They don't have relationships with Black sororities and fraternities. They don't have a relationship with the CBC. They don't have a relationship with lots of groups, 100 Black Men or Jack and Jill, or these various groups. And I think it is surfacing a fairly lazy kind of advocacy that has happened for over a decade that is going to come home to roost for charters, and that they're out of position to meet some of these threats. And I think that's why you have this dynamic where you have the levels of support that Derrell is talking about and that we see, and then this very complicated fraught politics at the top, and sort of it seems it's a paradox, or it's, there's a disconnect there. I think that's why, and I think it would behoove the charter community to talk about that more.
Can I jump on that? I mean,
Please,
Jeff, I know you know this from your time in California and everywhere, right? But it's like, totally agree with what you're saying, Andy. Like, part of this is a different hypothesis at the start of Charter Universe than at the current point in Charter Universe, right? So like the opening hypothesis was, we'll make these schools, they will be of incredibly high quality. We will only replicate the things that we think work or that meet that bar. And the experience will be so awesome, people will love us, and the politics will sort itself out. And that hypothesis has proven not to be true, right? It hasn't not given us great schools. It has, however, shown that there are lots of things that people care about in addition to whether or not their kids go to great schools. Like, they care about whether or not they see themselves in the leadership of the school, right? They care about things other than test scores. Like, I care about test scores, but they care about things other than test scores. They care about whether or not the schools sort of reflect highly local values that are kind of symbolic of community and that kind of stuff. And our chartering framework to date has not addressed those things. So like, in addition to building this connective tissue with essentially like the middle class, like Black institutions or their equivalent institutions in other communities of color, we also got to think about how we use the chartering tool to like meet this challenge of constituency in a very different way than we did 25 years ago.
Well, it's one of the reasons why I was motivated to make CharterFolk, which was because I felt like we're a bit askew on these kinds of issues. And I think that a facile judgment that some have is, if we can just build these relationships, we just do the outreach, which is of course important. Where the tire hits the road is, what are we advocating for? And if we advocate for the right things, the Divine Nine is going to be there with us. Maldef is going to be there for us. But we got to advocate for the right things. We have to show that charter schools are pushing things forward in a constructive way, right? And thus far, I think we've just simply lacked the creativity and the courage to come forward and propose those things. Let me drill down, though, just for a second on this. I'm also aware that I just think our advocacy is not as good as the other side is. And we've had many, many years of having an opportunity to be able to use the Department of Education to advance a charter school friendly agenda. And frankly, I think that we didn't do it. And I think, though, the other side, waiting for that moment to use the department to advance an anti-charter agenda, they're going to have so many great ideas and they're going to have so many ways to do it. I really am sobered by what we have in front of us. So the question for me really is, how aggressive do you think that Biden is going to be? Maybe, Andy, I'll come back to you, because you and I, shared that maybe Biden wants to be something of a unifier. The other point too here is, could it be that if we have a Republican Senate and he brings a more union-oriented Secretary of Ed as his nominated person, that they simply reject it, forcing something to be somewhat more mainstream? What are you thinking about the overall dynamics now that are going into who is selected here as the next secretary?
Well, I mean, the dynamics, I feel like people in education start with this idea of like who's it going to be and who are our favorite people or our least favorite people or whatever. Like, there's a lot of there is just a lot of factors that go into staffing and administration. Diversity in every sense of that word, which is obviously racial and ethnic, also different parts of the party. It is geography and making sure the country is represented. There's all these people you're going to have to take care of in different ways. There's lots of politics there, particularly with, you got, people who obviously have intentions to potentially run for president themselves, but want to be part of the administration. So where do you put them? Lots of things to balance. And as someone said earlier, this is not, education is not like the top tier. People are not waiting to find out who the Secretary of State is and then who the Secretary of Education is. It's definitely a second tier agency, although very important, obviously, to all of us. So I think there's a lot of factors that are going to go in there, and the agency does a lot of higher ed stuff. And so one path that the Biden people could pursue would simply be put a higher ed person in there. That's obviously an extremely high priority, just the issue of higher ed with the First Lady. Go that way and sort of sidestep these fights, especially because you have all these superintendents who are pretty reasonable, middle of the road types, like a Bill Haidt or a Sonia in Baltimore or whatever. And but they're at odds with their unions right now just because of COVID. And so it's just sort of it's a weird time. And so I tend to think that if the charter folks play their cards smart, they should not be out there picking fights. And there's obviously, there's always people who want to sort of poke the bear, but figure out where do you build political coalitions sort of more across the education sector around some of these issues. That's obviously most immediately COVID relief. Longer term, it's issues like infrastructure and funding and so forth, that there may be an opportunity for some politics, because Biden, I don't think his first instinct is going to be to skewer charter schools. I think he appreciates, the people around him appreciate the broad base of support, and that they would be potentially making the Republicans' project easier for them. So I think there's going to be a natural instinct towards some caution and moderation. Charters, though, need to play their cards carefully and pick up on that and turn it into something positive. Because it's not just going to happen. It won't just happen in a vacuum. Does that answer your question, Jed?
Yeah, I like this. So you're saying you think that there's going to be moderation from Biden, which would make it less likely that it's necessary for the Republicans to perhaps draw a line on who is nominated. I don't know, Hanna, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I guess I hope you're right, Andy. But I think you said it, and I think I said it, you said it, that, education isn't considered a top tier secretary appointment per se, even though it's very important. And with that in mind, it's also a place you could actually throw a really, you could placate some things without giving too much. And so my concern is that education becomes a place where there's actually a fair amount of giving. And it doesn't mean that your hypothesis, Andy, about the president building bridges and mending is inaccurate. I would just say, is education the place he's going to do it? And so I'll also say that I do agree completely with, if it's going to be the place he's going to do it, we have some work to do, and charter advocates have some work to do, and we need to be really savvy, because I think I'm less optimistic that education will be a place where there's bridges built and a peacemaking attempt, and so I think that's going to be up to us in some ways to make a case and do it smartly. I thought that was interesting, and I hadn't thought about a higher ed focus, but I totally agree with you that higher ed's up and important, and amongst both Republicans and Democrats, it's something that is teed up nicely. I was trying to juxtapose that with the reality that Biden's also made the promise that it will be a teacher and/or former teacher who takes this position. Doesn't mean it couldn't be somebody in higher ed, but I think that narrows things to a degree. So just a couple thoughts.
And Hanna, what do you think? Let's say that Biden decides to do something more aggressive. Let's say he's going to do something more threatening to charter schools. Do you think that this is an issue that is important enough that Republican senators may want to make a stand on that, or are they going to abide by the general idea? Hey, as even McConnell has said, hey, the president should basically be able to get his team. Are they going to let a very threatening secretary through, or might they decide to make that a real problem?
My gut is they'll. Oops. I'm
sorry. Say that again, Hanna. You just broke up for a second.
My apologies. My gut is they would make a stink for sure. And this is where the savvy, the importance of the savvy on our part comes into play, and how we build those bridges in Congress, et cetera, to bring certain clear messages to bear. But I would think at the end of the day, my gut is that Republicans will make a strong statement, but they will let the president choose his secretary.
But you can have, and we saw this with Betsy, you can have a situation where she performed very badly in her confirmation hearings. And so she was sort of irreparably damaged right out the gate, and she never recovered from that. And so it's not just about who gets confirmed. It's about what does that process look like? And you can bloody somebody up and make them essentially ineffective in the role. And that's what happened there. I mean, I think the best advice, Jed, and this is in your wheelhouse for charters, would boil down to, just from this conversation, hope for the best, work for the best, prepare for the worst. And some of the stuff you would do to prepare for the worst, the relationship building, the storytelling, the advocacy, that's just going to pay dividends anyway. And so that's just good thing. That's just good things for the charter community to be doing, that the charter community, again, has not really spent a lot of time doing over the last decade.
Can I hop onto this? Because I think it's important too. So it's like, look, I'm a recovering Manhattanite, right? Living in Jersey, grew up in Maryland, went to school in Philly. So I'm a creature of the Northeast, right? And all I'm saying is that, like, if we define the political problem of the moment only as one of how to court progressives in the party or how to placate only Democrats, we will lose, right? And so one of the important strategies, and I think we saw this around CSP down the stretch, which some people thought was sort of like, like a fastball at the head of charter supporters, because like I know we all know Jim Blue, like Jim Blue's a charter supporter, right? Is that there's also, if having Republican senators maybe, sort of say to the president, look, we know you got a lot of people, but you can't have this one. Or we know you got all these other people and they're more important than this one. Like, give us somebody like X. Then you got to do some work with those people so that they prioritize it too. So I think I just wanted to highlight that, because while I do think the problem of Ward 6 progressives is one we should just pick on DC, is one we should focus on, it is not the only strategy to sort of ensure a healthy environment for charters, at the federal level. And that means we got to have a play for if McConnell remains majority leader.
Mm-hmm. And go ahead, please, Hanna.
I was going to say, I may be segueing too early, so I'll just start this and you can cut it off if you want to route us, Jed. But I mean, I think that does really lead to what we saw across the country in election results. And there is a definite need for us to think about how do we strategically position charters with both Republicans and Democrats going forward, and how are we building the pressure points that are not solely focused on one party or the other, because that would be a mistake based on the results we're seeing across our country.
I could dive back into some things here at top of the ticket, but it's naturally going in this direction. Maybe I'll be able to return to them in our last few minutes. Let's talk a little bit more about what's going on at this.
It sounds like the kind of techno band that Derrell listens to.
I like electronica,
So let's see. What do you guys think about state results? We've certainly had a number of surprises. I know that, like, Texas is completely and utterly surprised. I think even what happened in New York, where people were thinking that the Democrats were going to have like a veto-proof level in the legislature, a number of things have turned out to be different than we were expecting. Any takeaways, any patterns that you guys are first focusing on?
Split verdict. Oh, go ahead, Derrell.
No, I would just say, like, some of our state campaigns were very successful electorally. Tennessee, New Mexico actually is one of them. Kind of uncover and a surprise. I saw the Texas thing. I think Colorado had something similar go on. And I want to get the number right. And Andy, I'm probably going to where you were going. Something like 22 state houses went sort of where Republicans picked up a chamber or whatever, and maybe it was like 9 for Democrats. So it's like, I only highlight this to say that it's like, DC is like a shiny object, right? And it's so easy to be like, ooh, sec ed, like, oh, wow, what's the president going to do? When really, the bulk of education policy, I'm going to tell you something you know already, is set at the state level, right? And state elections are giving us a different take, essentially, than the narrative, I think, that is emerging from the presidential. And it's like, look, 75 million people voted for Biden, was the highest popular turnout for a president ever. 70 million people voted for President Trump. That's the second highest turnout ever, right? Yeah. So like the message to me is that, like, at the state level, people are very divided. I don't want to use divided in the way we would normally use it right now. I would just say that, like, if you flip a coin, there's a 1 in 2 chance that a person sitting next to you is made the other decision. And to me, it's like, we got to start with that as like just like a fact pattern upon which we build all of our policy advocacy now, like at the state level. And I think the state results, Jed, they reflect the fact that there is space there to do that. Because if you just follow like the national narrative, everybody's killing everybody in the streets, in places other than Portland, it just isn't. That's not necessarily how it happens when real people have to reconcile these things with one another.
Yeah, Andy?
I'll pick up on that. I mean, I agree with Derrell. I think we're all glad to see New Mexico getting back on its feet. Sorry.
It's a high bar.
I'll pick up on what Derrell said. I think it was a split verdict, and you saw some really interesting things. So Florida, for the second cycle in a row after 2018, went statewide very consistently Republican. Trump won it, and I mean, we knew the results down there very early. Yet they also increased the minimum wage. California, which is obviously a very strong progressive state, but some progressive priorities. I mean, the affirmative action referendum went down decisively, despite the pro-repeal folks who wanted to bring back affirmative action had an enormous resource advantage, like, more than 10-1. And that they couldn't get the tax thing done there. But yet Arizona got tax reform. Some other states had, even little Arkansas, which is not a place you think of as sort of a bastion of taxes, codified a higher tax on their state ballot. So I think where it all goes is there's a hunger out there for pragmatism. Voters are frustrated, and you see in both candidates, both Biden and Trump's vote, like a high degree of frustration. And so I think there's an opportunity if the party that continues to pursue the sort of subtraction strategy and the sort of alienating people strategy is going to be the party that struggles. And so it's whichever party gets its act together, there's an opportunity for sort of an additive politics there that's sort of problem solving and so forth. I think we would all like to think education can be a piece of that. I think there's a path there. There's a path there where it can, but it's going to require the Democratic brand is not strong in a lot of places, and people are not buying what's on offer, and we saw that, and that should cause some soul searching. And the Republicans, again, they have a huge decision to make about which direction they go, and I think President Trump will not make that any easier. He's going to be out there as a specter over them. But I think there's an opportunity for an additive politics. Because if you look, like, it's hard to tell a consistent story. There's lots of, like, I mean, as with every election of the last few, like, monocausality is the big winner of every election now. So everyone's got these theories that like this or that. Like, if you look, it's actually a complicated landscape with I think some real opportunities and some opportunities for education to get into some of those slipstreams.
Hanna, any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I would just I would agree with my colleagues and double down on. I think while we've given a ton of attention, and rightfully so, to the DC hub, I think some really important action and that determines probably long term, and also signals long term where our country is headed. And if we go back to charters, I'm not saying there's not decisive things that can happen in DC that we should be very savvy and ready for. I am saying that at the state level, we should not underestimate the signal that this election sent, and we should be prepared and ready to be on our game at the local level in moving the needle. I think I'm optimistic on that front and believe that there are opportunities we maybe didn't see pre-election, or certainly didn't see at the degree and the magnitude that just played out.
And I think one thing that I think is important, it ties in this conversation, Democrats didn't get the gains they needed at the state to really alter the redistricting landscape. And so there are a lot of reformers, particularly sort of in Washington and the coast, like all the places that Derrell's from, who like don't really want to have to talk to Republicans and so forth. And Derrell's point on sort of look to your right, look to your left is a really important one, because this was not the kind of election that sort of set in motion political dominance. And so if you want to be a partisan, go be a partisan. If you want to do work on charter schools, you're going to have to be able to talk to people you might disagree with on other things politically, and you're going to have to be able to talk across political lines of difference in order to be effective.
Can I I'm being Jed. I'm being a jerk. I just want to jump on this because it's so good. So like if you were in reform world, right? In particular, and I want to be respectful of this, because of COVID, what reform is very different right now than it was like 8 months ago. And so to me, like, you know, if it's like, I was looking at the president-elect's letter about whatever, and his list of priorities, the top one is COVID response. The second one is the economy. And so to me, like, if there's anything that has shown how sclerotic some of our institutions have become, it is COVID, right? And at the center of that has been our public education institutions overall. Not to say there aren't good people trying to do good things, but overwhelmingly, kids of all income levels and all locations are getting the short end of the stick. And like the hubris and self-interest, like in Arlington, I think is what it is, you know, people are driving buses around empty, right? I mean, it's like, come on, guys, you can't, you know, this is just outrageous, you know, when you consider what this is up against. So I would just say, I think that the way for charters in particular to build the best constituent, to get new friends and everything, is to help solve for that problem right now. Be a part of the answer to the educational challenges of COVID, right? Ask for flexibilities, freedom, finance, all of these things that help you fill that gap in. And like, do it because education matters, because education is, you know, to me, like, is the fundamental thing. But also do it because like you're going to have a ton more friends after you solve the problem of a mom who has to go to work. As a kid at home getting cracked virtual because the local district won't enroll them, like that person is a loyalist. That person votes for you. That person stands up for you when you are not there.
Yeah, I think the landscape was set up in one way pre-COVID, right? COVID ends up as this like tidal wave, right? And we don't know what the landscape's going to look like when this thing recedes. I think there were things about the landscape that we really didn't like pre-COVID, things that were setting up that looked very sobering and threatening. But I think this election more broadly was not about charter schools, and might not have been about education at all. But what I think is really quite interesting is how education advocates riding the COVID wave and playing the right play in a number of races nudged the direction well. Texas, it's probable that the charter school advocacy world probably helped in a half dozen races. Andrew, in Illinois, I mean, there's just some masterful work going on there. I've read some about Tennessee. What happened in Indianapolis, that they were able to get that done against all this other broader stuff. So it just speaks to, hey, sometimes things are not about us, but if we are astute in the moment of it not being about us, we can still achieve very important things. But we got to be in the game, right? I'm sorry, I couldn't help myself. Hanna, please take it where you were going to, but I want to insert that one idea anyway.
Couldn't agree with you more. And I'm just saying, you know, Derrell, if that's you being a jerk interjecting, then keep preaching, and you've got some allowances on the jerk side. I would say couldn't agree with you more. I think it's not just what you just said, Jed, about, you know, the pivotal moments that have played. We need to adjust our lens to the reality that charters exist because we have a problem we want to solve. And they still exist because we have a problem we want to solve. And actually, we've got more than ever. And actually, charters can be a huge solution. And I think the key is making it about the solution and getting focused on what matters most to the people that are hurting the most, which is also where we started with charters. And so there's a consistent theme. It does mean we have to shift because we're in a new space and time, and we don't necessarily have the luxury of the alliances we had before that came very easily, I think, at one point, that don't come as easily, at least in the last 5 years or so. But let's not mistake the incredible moment we're in that, like I said, charters exist for a reason, and they still exist for that reason. In fact, they have more reasons than ever to serve parents and kids that desperately need a solution everywhere across our country more than ever.
I think we shouldn't underestimate also the work at the local level. And so like we just got like a new Democratic senator from Arizona, but he's not going to really be able to be hardcore against charters because they're just such a fixture of the education landscape there, right? You've got obviously Hickenlooper in Colorado. So people, you mentioned charter schools in the context of U.S. Senate, people immediately think of like Cory Booker or Tom Carper, like who are both like great champions of charter schools. But you've quietly within the Democratic caucus, you now have lots of senators who are not going to be very excited about taking that on because of home state politics and popularity, and that number is just sort of growing. And I think that's the kind of thing what we were talking about earlier. It's not just a Republican Democratic issue, and reformers should be really careful not to make it one. The politics, because of all this work, are more complicated. The one thing I would suggest that those advocates are going to need, and a real threat to charters that doesn't get a lot of attention, is this issue of assessment and accountability and data. One of the reasons charters can survive is you have a lot of thoughtful people who behind the scenes, they look at that data on urban charter schools, and they're going to go do what they have to do politically, but they don't want to see schools like that closed. They understand those schools are options that are working for parents. As Hanna just said, they're solving a problem that parents and communities have. But if we lose that data and it just becomes sort of, who's politically stronger and pushing and shoving, that will be a real existential threat to charter schools. The data sort of very quietly keeps some people kind of on the sidelines.
Well, and more importantly, right, and this is so like all of our states basically have adopted these kind of like two takes on assessment, which was like, one, you should have something early so that people know where their kids are, right? Given the break from the summer or whatever. And two, even if it's noisy, you should do the state assessment next year, right? And obviously there are people who are positioned against that, right? They're like, no tests ever. Like this is the window to have no tests ever. The very practical effect of that is that it's like 50%, 50% of the schools in the country, right? Like all the charter schools have some student achievement metric that is tied to annual assessments that ladders up to reauthorization. Right. So if you eliminate that, then you're like, whoa, how do you make the case the information's not there, right? So I think it's very sinister, and it's very important to stay focused on assessment, not just for the reason you're talking about, Andy, which is a really good one, which I hadn't thought about, but just from the practice, like Buffalo Science, right? Like in upstate New York, we just shut that school down. It's through the roof, right? And they were forced to retreat on it, but we could see like a whole raft of those sort of like, data-driven or undata-driven closures if that information isn't there anymore.
Well, Jed, here's the advocacy question. I mean, like getting to Derrell's point, like, so we want to get rid of assessments. Getting rid of assessments, that's like the defund the police of education policy. Like it tickles advocates, but it's not widely supported at all on the ground. But does the charter community sort of have the tensile strength to like drive that point home? And does the education reform movement have the tensile strength to drive that home? Or are they so cowed by that loud voice of getting rid of testing that they're gonna sort of roll over on it?
I almost spit my water out there. I almost spit my water out there.
Go, Hanna. I'm not getting it.
This
I got my
assessment
ideas on that one for sure.
I feel like, it's already been said twice. I'm going to say it a third time. At the end of the day, we miss that. We miss the, in my opinion, all the things we've said that are opportunities coming are at risk and hinge on, or certainly correlate to, whether or not we are able to hold the importance of assessment and accountability within education writ large that becomes a huge piece of the stability for charter schools and the reason that we can validate and show the success. And I also think that, Andy, I think you just said this, the reform community and charter advocates, which often have a great deal of overlap, need to figure out really quickly how they're going to work together on this issue and not get stuck in what seems big but is minutia if we say these things are important. And I just think there's a real, we are in a really significant moment around this piece that could determine a lot. And I would hate to be looking back over our shoulder going, oh, bleep, we knew it was big, but we didn't know it was that big. And the other thing I would say is this is also takes me straight back to the state importance of states right now and the courage we need of our state chiefs, our state boards of education, and others. I don't know how many I've watched say, well, I'm waiting to see, instead of taking a stand and saying, this is not something you wait and see on. These are our kids. Yeah. This is their success. This is their results. Their parents deserve to know. And if you want choice and opportunities for your kids in your state, waiting to see is the most uncourageous thing I've heard in a long time if you claim to be for kids.
I think this is just a great conversation. It's right at what I'm obsessing on, at CharterFolk every day. And there are these foundational pieces, having data in the landscape that is essential for our world to be able to succeed. And our adversaries have recognized this, and they are erasing everything that they possibly can from the landscape. The question, though, is can we find the new way to bring forward a policy agenda such that we're stronger on those anchoring pieces? And I'm not sure if they're best, if we're strongest charging directly at the anchor, or if there's some new things that we can be doing around equity, around trying to position charter schools as fundamentally fairer on some of these issues of how money is used and how we admit kids to schools and those kinds of things. But whether or not we're ready, Andy, to try anything new to position us better, I think is still an open question, and why conversations at this moment, I think, are so important. Let me think. I want to get to broader trends, and I was thinking of maybe a way to surface this using Colorado, my home state, and where Hanna is right now. Just thinking about if you had said to CharterFolk 10 years ago that from the state of California or state of Colorado, we would have 2 senators who would be so strong on charter schools, right? And if we had a governor who was going to be so strong and who had an experience as deep in charter schools as Jared Polis does, oh my goodness, we're doing so many things right? And I think actually you could argue that we did do a lot of great things right. My question, though, is, do you guys think in the broader trends that are happening that we're setting ourselves up such that 10 years from now, the next generation of senator from the state of Colorado or from wherever is in the chute? Or is something happening to us right now that is perhaps preventing us from moving in a similar trajectory? And now's the moment for us to be thinking differently about these things. And maybe there are lessons that we can take from this very election, which point us to do what some of those smarter things might be.
I love Colorado. I don't live there, but if you want somebody to roll through, holler at me. I think the important thing about Colorado is that it demonstrates something that Arizona also demonstrates. And this is the thing that the Northeast does not demonstrate, which is that when charters serve a diverse constituency of families by location and ethnicity, right, and interest, they have diverse political support that translates into having a governor and 2 senators who support your issue. And for very good reasons of that moment, charter schools like in the Northeast, we were concentrating on closing achievement gaps for low-income kids of color who had very little choice and who were surrounded by chronically underperforming schools. And that does not translate into a diverse political constituency in terms of geography, location, or income, right? It's not to say it's not an important constituency, but it's not like that constituency. And so to me, to reach a world 10 years from now that looks like what Colorado and Arizona look like requires the application of the creativity of Colorado and Arizona in New York, Newark, et cetera, right? Like I think Florida is probably a very good example of this too. Like you're not going to get a U.S. senator from Florida who's against charters and choice. It's just not going to happen because like the tools are being used everywhere. So I think whatever the setup is, and this is hard, particularly in like the more highly regulated states. I think like obviously like California, for its high regulation, actually has like a diverse, as you know, Jed, has like a diverse portfolio of charter schools. But this is a hard lesson for like the anchor states, if you want to call it that, in charter schools to learn and know, and it will inhibit their building more diverse, powerful, durable political constituencies in the future if they don't learn it.
And I just want to, I agree. And Jed, you said something I want to punctuate. And you said, you started by saying a decade ago, this work was done. And I don't think a decade plus is what I would say, where there was the ground was tilled in such a way that you can't go back. And interesting, I'll just say this. I hope that's true for our president-elect as well, that what you say and what you've built on over time, you actually have to deliver on in the charter space. But we should not negate the time, the courage, and the groundwork that was laid. That it wasn't last year, it wasn't 2 years, it was not an election cycle. It was way before that, and it actually wasn't about the election. It was once again back to what is this for our people, our students, our families, and how are we going to create better choices and options. And I just think we should not let your point, Jed, about 10 years ago fly by us. Lots of work, lots of investment to get to the place where the political sphere actually stands in its shoes, because they don't have a choice, because across their state or the spaces they represent, there is no wiggle room.
Yeah, I guess I may have a slightly different view on this. So I think the 10-year ago problem was in 2008, reformers and a lot of funders and philanthropic interests, for that matter, kind of declared victory. Arnie Duncan was becoming Secretary of Education. Steve Brill wrote a book that, Reformers 101, and cornered the teachers unions. And, in politics, you never want to get too up or too down. It's always fluid. And, those things did not happen. But what it led to is sort of just a disinvestment in sort of context and conditions work, like tilling the ground, I guess, as Hanna has said, that like just how do you just creating sort of a debate, a public awareness around these issues and so forth. And I think you pay a huge price for that because politics abhors a vacuum. And I think and we're still paying a price for that. And reformers have sort of defaulted to sort of a very elite style of politics, rather than just going out there, making the argument, persuading people. And that's because like we talk about these senators and we're defaulting to that now. It's great. Like having a Michael Bennet is great and a Cory Booker, that's terrific. But like, you never hear like the NRA, and they've fallen on hard times lately. But like, if you look historically at like their ability to do advocacy, they never worried about like who their person was going to be, who was their Michael Bennet or who was their Cory Booker. They had like a whole party of them, right? And to Derrell's position, what he was saying about Florida, like it's an untenable position in Florida now not to be like this, to be for choice in Florida. We need to make that the default position everywhere by changing context and conditions. And I worry that we focus on sort of individuals and personalities and these things at the expense of just how do you create a situation where it's not okay for the average bear to be against this. And when you look at the data, I mean, look, we all know there's some problems in the charter school sector, but overall, when you look at the data, particularly on urban charter schools, it's a very compelling case as a public policy solution. And so how do we sort of make it so that people just cannot continue to sort of throw up noise and so forth on that? And I think what should worry the charter world is just how bad the atmospherics are right now and how badly we've failed at achieving that. And that is sort of, to me, that is the task ahead, is just how do you make the context and conditions so to some extent this is a non-issue. And there's some things we should do. To your earlier question, Jen, I was thinking like I never understand why charter proponents don't link their issue to fiscal equity. Like the school finances systems in most of these states are by historical design, they're highly inequitable along, particularly along race lines, but along race and class lines, and we should be addressing that. And I don't understand why charters want to win some sort of esoteric debate about education spending. We should be people who are investing in the system, spending the money more equitably, and giving parents more options. That's a winning position, and that changes the context and conditions. But for some reason, we love to have intramural fights about all of these things.
We're at 50 minutes.
Wait,
I'll come to you. I'll come to you, Derrell.
Let Derrell.
I know I said it to Jen earlier. I just want to say, Andy, I noticed you got an X-wing up there, and that is also awesome. So that is
that is my childhood X-wing. You have a sharp eye. Yes.
So we have about 10 minutes, maybe a little less thereabouts to wrap up here. There's so many fascinating comments here. I could go in a lot of different directions here. But maybe let's bring this back to something a little bit more granular. Your guys' specific advice for charter schools. I think, Andy, you were talking about there are things that we could be doing in these early months of a Biden administration that would be poking the bear in a maybe counterproductive way. At the same time, I think we're all envisioning that there could be some things that could be proposed that could be that would require a response from us. So maybe could the three of you just, help me get smarter on what would be responses that are helpful, what are responses that are appropriate, and what might be counterproductive in your minds is in terms of early months of Biden administration.
I guess I'll start easy one. Take yes for an answer. I think there are some folks in the charter school community, they just relish the fight. Be willing to take yes for an answer, and be smart about the politics. If we're talking about big increases in federal spending, like it's not the time to have some grad school discussion on sort of the ROI on education spending over the last 40 years. It's time to say, how do charters get an equitable share of that? How do we make sure that money is leveraging the kind of structural reforms that the system needs? And I feel like, this is real life stuff that affects real families, and that by extension means you've got to do real politique. And I think it'll be a test for the sector. If it turns into an exercise in restricting and constraining charters, which it could, then charters should fight. That's a hugely important fight on behalf of parents and kids who need better options. But my big piece of advice would be ready to take yes for an answer. Everything doesn't have to be a big jihad.
And if we see a secretary nominated who we're very concerned about, do we let our concerns be known before the vote, or do we recognize that this is just something that we need to allow the new president to be able to choose?
I would say make your concerns known, and bear in mind the Senate has its advise and consent role, and there are plenty of Democratic senators who we've just gone through a long list of them. Some states have two of them who would be concerned about this, and so I think don't turn it into everything. Everyone wants everything to be a Democrat-Republican issue now because that's easier. People like that, but don't make it one. This is a charter proponent, charter opponent issue, and there are Democrats who will be on the pro-charter side of that fight. So don't throw up headwinds for them. Support them in asking hard questions and so forth.
Hanna, any advice you'd give us generally?
Yeah, I'll go a little bit more local in my tact, and I think we've talked about it. Number one, don't forget why charters exist, and that's to help students and parents. That has not gone away. In fact, double down on that between COVID and education in general in the state that we're in. We need great solutions more than ever, and we should be a part of the solution, if possible, avoid the political battle and just become a part of the solution. Two, do not lose sight of the importance of assessments in this time in particular. It is not a small side thing that maybe charter advocates should weigh in on, as a help to some ed reform space. It must be part of a priority and a platform, if you will, of importance. And three, don't ignore. And I think Andy and I were saying some overlapping things around the fact of what's happened in states like Arizona, Colorado, Florida. They've laid the groundwork early on, even earlier than tying it to a person that has been incredibly helpful. And that should still be a part of the strategy for charters, that it becomes part of the ethos of a state to the degree that it's no longer an option.
Derrell, thoughts?
Yeah, like so plus 20 on all that. I think all right, so the one quick thing to Andy's point, like particularly around federal stimulus money, don't, and you know, I work on all kinds of choice, support all kinds of choice. Don't be the charter guy showing up being like, all right, I'm all for districts getting more money and I'm all for charters getting more money, but not those schools over there, right? If somebody's handing out money, go get the money, right? Because all kids need the money right now. So that's the first thing. I think that's very important. The second thing is on the secretary piece, just because we were talking about it a lot. If it's a bad secretary, we should attack it like a weak gazelle at the edge of the herd, right? With everybody and all the ferocity possible, because that's exactly what would happen if the situation were reversed, and essentially that did happen, right? And that compromised the positive intent of a secretary for 4 years, right? And that has also not been helpful. The last thing, and Jed, you and I have been talking about this, have talked about this before. I made the mistake of getting into some exchange on Twitter. It was good natured, but I shouldn't have done it. And basically, like, I think one of the things charter folk need to be aware of is that you have a fight about what charters are in the public education world a lot, where the vocabulary is not similar. So somebody says, well, public schools are open to all and charter schools aren't. And you're like, what? Right? And the fact, and in every way possible, public schools we know that are not open to all because of residential assignment, because of redlining, all of these things, because of elite magnet schools, because of testing, because if you can buy the right house, you get all of these things. And I would just urge everybody to from an advocacy standpoint, if you were going to go hard on anything, it is not having charter schools be defined as like the bete noir of this public education, like golden thing over here that does not really exist. Like we gotta define these things to reality, and then we can talk about how to make them both better. We can't have a genuine conversation about improvement if somebody says public schools, puts up, you know, a box of rules that aren't real, and then somebody says charter schools and proceeds to attack them in a similar fashion.
So I'll just throw in one last thought myself. It's stimulated by you, Andy, talking about 2008 and how we perhaps rested on our laurels. I think I missed that meeting, or maybe California really is a different country. I was hired into CCSA in 2009, and we could see that if we ever had a terrible governor, we were going to, you know, just have a world of hurt. And so it was just maniacal urgency to build as much political strength as we possibly could before that would happen. And I'm aware of now a number of legislatures where things haven't gone as bad as maybe people were fearing them to go. But I hope this does not result in anybody taking their foot off the gas. Maybe we've bought a little bit more time, right? But we need to be building with all the urgency that we can. And I think we need to be thinking very carefully about how we can build policy ideas that resonate on both sides of the aisle. Because I actually think that both Democrats and Republicans in this education space have some equity overlap that they want to be a part of. It's there for the taking. The question is, can we be creative enough to come up with those ideas? Any last thoughts you guys want to share? Anything that we've forgotten or left out? We've got like just a minute or whatever. Anybody want to throw something in?
Well, I think you just put it out there. Just imagine for a moment the conversation we'd be having right now, regardless of like who had won the national election or whatever, but the conversation we'd be having if in more places that had that laser-like focus like you all did in California on getting ready for the rainy day, building support and so forth. Hasn't been perfect out there. You guys have had your bumps, but like you're in the charter schools out there in a strong position. And if we were sort of really replicating that aggressively in those kinds of playbooks, the conversation the four of us would be having would probably be on a different set of issues.
Great. Well, listen, to all you guys, so happy to have had you for this conversation. And I know people are going to love this. Don't be surprised if I'm emailing you again and see if I can, you know, get you for another one down the road. But for taking time at this key moment, I'm just very, very thankful.
Thanks for having us.
Appreciate it.
See you guys.
Bye-bye.